I recently saw a new job advertised at work. It looked like my experience would align quite nicely, and it looked like a good step forwards in my career. So I went and spoke to a couple of trusted colleagues, and they agreed. So I put in an application, and sure enough, a few days later, I get the email to say, "You've been invited to interview." So I did what everybody does nowadays. I went off to ChatGPT to prepare. I worked through some questions. It gave me feedback. Don't say that, say this. The day came and I was feeling quite ready. I tried my best to answer the questions and build some rapport, which in virtual interviews is just so difficult. And then before I knew it, the interview was over. And then it dawned on me. The hard part hadn't actually finished. The hard part was just beginning. Because you see, now I had done everything I could do to influence the outcome. All that was left to do was to just wait. And the experience of waiting and not having that opportunity to influence anymore left me feeling powerless. Last week we started this series, Worth the Wait, and we're looking at seasons of prolonged waiting, seasons that many of us have likely experienced. Maybe we've waited on something physical, financial, or relational. Waiting for that thing that we've invested in, hoped for, or dreamed for. Maybe it's an answer to prayer, for clarity, direction, or healing. And Paul showed us last week that these seasons can leave us feeling discomfort and disappointment, frustration and fatigue. But we learned that God does some of his best and most important work while we are waiting. Because you are worth the wait. Your future self is worth the wait. We looked at how God is working for our good, conforming us to the image of Jesus, which is best for us. And we saw how a proper expectation can shift our frustration to anticipation. So today then we're going to unpack the feeling of being powerless. Because these seasons of waiting can often leave us feeling helpless. When we can't influence it anymore for the outcome that we hoped for or dreamed for, we feel stuck. And the strange thing is, this is really logical. You see, we are hardwired to believe that we can influence outcomes. Our experience of life tells us this, and we sum it up in the law of cause and effect, which explains the relationship between two events, where one is the consequence of the other. And we can sum that up in two words: if, then. And this isn't just theory, this is actually how we experience life. Because if something happens to us, we know that if we did a particular thing, or if we didn't do a particular thing, then the thing that happened either does or doesn't happen. Let me give you a really basic example. If I touch a hot radiator, I burn my hand. And my brain says, don't do that, it's stupid and it really hurts. So next time I see a really hot radiator, I don't touch it. And I don't burn my hand. I've successfully controlled the outcome. But the problem is, this way of thinking leads us to confusion and frustration in our seasons of waiting. Because when we've done everything that we've told ourselves to do, when we've done everything that other people have told us to do, when we've done everything that other people have done that bring them the positive outcomes and it hasn't happened for us, we're left feeling confused. And when this happens, we often find ourselves in one of the most common forms of unhappiness, a feeling of discontent. The problem that we experience is that we're not where we planned to be. We're not experiencing what we hoped for or what we dreamed for. Or we're still waiting for that thing, the thing that we thought we would already have or achieved or overcome by now. And the problem is, when our discontent overlaps with our powerlessness, we find ourselves in this danger zone. And the problem with the danger zone is it prompts us to act and think in ways that we don't usually act or think. when we feel discouraged and we feel stuck, like we've got no control, we can't change things, we start to ask ourselves, what's wrong with me? And it's not just discouragement. It turns into disillusionment. And we take things to the extreme. We say, if I never get that thing, I will never be happy. We say, I'll never get through this. Or we become fixated on something. And if that becomes prolonged, we feel defeated. We start to give up. We tell ourselves, nobody cares. Does God even care? Do you know what? I'm not even sure I care anymore. And the ironic thing is, when we get to this point, we go back to applying cause and effect. We say, if I don't ever achieve that thing, something's wrong with me. If I never arrive at that destination, I'll never be happy. If they won't do that thing, or if God doesn't do that thing, then it doesn't matter what I do. And this is where our discontent becomes dangerous. Because we start to do things that ultimately lead to regret. And if you're sat here this morning thinking this sounds like you, you are completely normal. Because you're not where you wanted to be, and you feel like there's nothing you can do. Because if there was something you could do, you'd have done it by now. You've done everything you've been told to, everything you know how to do, and you're still waiting. So you find yourself discouraged, disillusioned. You think you'll never be happy, and you're thinking of giving up. So here's a question then. When there's nothing you can do, nothing that seems to make a difference in a season of waiting, what do you do? Well, let me tell you, one of the most influential people in history found himself in exactly a situation like this. But he claimed to have discovered the secret for dealing with your discontent. Now, I'm talking about the Apostle Paul. If you don't know about Paul, he starts his life as a Jewish radical. And his job is to persecute the earliest followers of Jesus. And then he has this miraculous encounter with Jesus himself, and he decides to start following him. So he leaves Jerusalem, and he travels around the entire Roman Empire, telling everybody that he meets about Jesus. And here's why I think you should listen. Whether you are a follower of Jesus or not, here's why I think you should take the words of Paul seriously. After 10 years of traveling the Roman Empire, he's been run out of town, he's been beaten up, he's been arrested, and he finds himself in prison in Rome. And while he's in Rome, Nero is the emperor, and Nero is known for having no mercy. So Paul's in prison. He's effectively on death row. He knows he's going to die. He just doesn't know yet what kind of death he's going to face. And while Paul's there, he writes 4 letters to encourage other followers of Jesus. And they are these 4: Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Philemon. So while Paul is sat in a season of waiting, his plans are thwarted. There's nothing he can do to change them. He's writing to other people to encourage them. And that's why I think you should take him seriously. Paul knows what these seasons of waiting are like. He knows what it feels like to be powerless and discontent. And today we're going to look at his letter to the Philippians, which Paul wrote in response to a care package sent to him by the followers of Jesus in Philippi. And here's what he says. He says, "I rejoiced greatly in the Lord that you at last renewed your concern for me." He says, you reminded me that people care. And in these seasons of waiting, it's so important to understand that people do still care. And he says, indeed you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. If you are thinking of someone this morning that you could reach out to remind them that you care, don't miss that opportunity. If you want to take your phone out right now, I will not be offended, because your encouragement might be the very thing that prevents them from their next big regret. And Paul goes on. He says, I am not saying this because I'm not in need. I'm not saying this because I'm not in need. But Paul's in prison. Does Paul know something that the rest of us don't? Is Paul going to escape? No, he goes on to say, "For I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances." Paul isn't saying he's happy about his circumstances. He's not saying he doesn't wish he could change his circumstances and be free. He says, "I've learned," which means Paul has been in a situation where he's discontent. But that's changed. But we know that Paul is still in prison. His circumstances haven't changed. So the only thing that can have changed is his discontent. Paul has learned to be okay in his circumstances, even if nothing changes. Paul has discovered that even if your external circumstances don't change, inside you still can. And you see, this defies our logic of cause and effect, and this kind of messes with us. Because Paul's learned something that interrupts the cycle that leads so many of us to be ruled by our discontent. Because when we're discontent, we think and act in ways driven by that, ways that lead to regret. And so if we can learn what Paul has learned, it could rescue us from our next big regret. Paul continues and he says, "I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty." You see, that's important. Discontent is not only for the people that are in need. The reality is many of us here this morning, if not most of us here this morning, we have plenty, but we still find ourselves feeling discontent. And he goes on, he says, "I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation." Now that's really bold. Paul's not saying I'm learning. He's not saying I'm trying. He's saying I've already learned. I'm there. I've finished the process. And if you're anything like me, your first reaction to a claim like this is, "Really? Are you sure, Paul? I mean, that sounds a little bit too good to be true, doesn't it?" And if you spend any time on the internet nowadays, you've probably seen claims that are too good to be true, like these. Guaranteed investment returns. Just click here. Miracle weight loss solutions, or my personal favorite, this one. You have inherited a large sum of money from a long-lost relative. So when Paul says he's learned the secret for every circumstance, I think, really? Not my situation, Paul, not my circumstances. Mine are just too serious. Mine has just gone too wrong. Surely this can't be true for me. But what is the secret that Paul's learned? Well, if you've been around church for any length of time, you've probably seen this verse. And it's most likely you've seen it taken out of context, so I might spoil one of your favorite verses this morning, I'm sorry. The verse is this: "I can do all this through him," that's Jesus, "who gives me strength." You see, ironically, we've ended up where we started. We've ended up with a cause and effect, an if-then situation, but one that's very different to what they looked like before. What Paul says here is, if Jesus is in me, strengthening me, anything is possible. I'm no longer controlled by my circumstances. I can't, but Jesus can, through his strength, not mine. As I said, this verse is often misquoted. You've probably seen images like this before. Now, these are not bad things to aspire to, pushing cars or lifting heavy weights or climbing big mountains. They're all great things. They're just not what Paul had in mind when he wrote this verse. The context of what Paul is saying here is not literally, you can do anything. He's saying through Jesus strengthening you, you can learn to endure all things. You can learn to endure each and every set of circumstances that life throws your way. Not through your strength or your willpower or determination, but through the strength that comes from Jesus living in us, through his strength. But to really get the context, sometimes we have to back up a little bit, so let's do that. So earlier, still in the letter of Philippians, still in chapter 4, Paul says this. He says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God." Paul says, take anything and everything to God. Pray to him about everything. Talk to him about everything. He says, don't be shy about what's in your hearts, what's on your minds. Share your desires, your fears, everything with him. But when you do that, remember everything that he's done for you. Remember everything that he's provided you already. Because when these two things live side by side, the times that we truly have need are also the times when we truly have so much. But this is a discipline, declaring our dependence on God. If Christ, then I. If Christ strengthens me, then I can endure. But this isn't just a nice idea. See, this is something to practice. And one way we can do this is to actually name what's inside of us. It might sound something like, God, I'm discontent about that thing. I feel powerless because of this thing. But thank you today that you have given me this. God, I can't do this, but you can. Please give me peace as I wait. Now, we're going to come back to that later, because that is the secret to the internal content that Paul has learned. He's learned to choose to live in a state of being aware of his dependence on God. And that discipline is the antidote to our discontent and our feeling of powerlessness. Of course we are powerless, but God isn't. Of course we are powerless, but Jesus living in us isn't. So we should bring our discontent to him daily. We should bring our want and our plenty to God, expressing our gratitude and asking him for our desires. Because when we bring both, we can find something to be grateful for. Because it's not just in our need that we are dependent on God. Maybe we're more aware of it when we are in need, but we're not more dependent. And doing this, developing this discipline, leads to contentment. It's important to remember that nothing God has prepared for you is going to go to somebody else because they get there first. God has got good plans for each and every one of us. He's working together for our future, and he's inviting us to trust him, bringing all of the things to him, telling him our need and thanking him for what he's done. And Paul goes on to say that when we do this, then the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. The peace that transcends, the peace that doesn't make sense. This is the context of verse 13. The dependence on God is the path that leads to contentment, leads to peace beyond understanding, and the type of contentment and peace that guards our hearts and our minds against the destructive desires and thoughts. When we declare our dependence and we say, I can't, but you can, with Christ strengthening me, all things are possible, it starts to guard our hearts against discouragement, disillusionment, and it protects us from the thoughts and actions which ultimately lead to regret. So the context for do all things probably looks a little bit more like a single parent looking at a pile of bills they've got to pay this month, wondering how on earth they're going to make ends meet. It might look like a partner laying awake in bed at night, feeling distant from their spouse, wondering how on earth did my relationship get here? How are we ever going to get through this? Or it might look like someone sat in a hospital waiting room, waiting for a diagnosis, unsure what the future holds. They did an experiment at Harvard University many years ago now, and it's a little bit brutal, and it's not something that would be repeated nowadays, but stick with me because there is an important lesson in this. They took some rats and they put each rat in a glass cylinder filled with water. And there was no way for the rat to escape. And so these rats are struggling to swim, struggling to stay afloat. And after about 15 minutes, some of these rats give up and they drown. But other rats are taken out of the cylinder and they're given a really short rest before they're put back in again. Now what they found is that second time round, some of those rats endured for up to 60 hours. From 15 minutes to 60 hours. And you see, in these seasons of prolonged waiting, when we learn that someone cares, when we learn that there's someone we can depend on, it's powerful and it gives us hope. And these seasons create these really intense learning experiences for us. And if we can live through things like this, then we might learn what Paul learned. That when God rescues you, when God shows up, next time round, that peace comes quicker. When you know that he cares. The peace that comes from our dependence on God is worth the wait. It creates a closeness and a confidence and a trust beyond anything we know. Our discontent, more than anything, leads to self-destructive directions, decisions and behaviors that ultimately cause regret and pain. And when it comes to faith, our discontent leads to disappointment, and it tempts us to run away from God. Philippians, in his book, Disappointment with God, writes these words: "The only thing worse than disappointment with God is disappointment without God." The sad fact is that disappointment is inevitable in life, but disappointment without God makes it much more difficult to get through. But if we run to God and declare our dependence on him daily, it might not change our circumstances, but it might bring peace. I think it's likely that we all know people who either right now or in the past have been through things beyond our imagination, and we wonder, how do they cope? How do they keep going? They're not happy, they're not in control, and I think they probably know both those things. But they probably decided to put their trust in the one who can provide them with peace. Trust in that he will show up, that he will help them, even if their circumstances don't change. So as we bring this to a close then, let me ask you this question. What is the primary source of your discontent? Are you lonely? Did you expect that you would have met someone by now? Are you tired of waiting around for Mr. and Mrs. Right and you're considering settling? Are you in a relationship that hasn't turned out the way you'd imagined? And your home situation is making you consider quitting? Are you frustrated in your career? Have you not reached the level that you thought you would have done by now? And you're tired of waiting for the right opportunity, and you're thinking about cutting corners? Or have you put your career on hold for the last 10 years to care for your family? And you're not feeling fulfilled, you're feeling discouraged, watching everything you've worked for fall apart. Are you feeling tired of chasing one path after another, and they all seem to end in dead ends, and you don't know what to do? Let me give you one more Bible verse. This one was written hundreds of years before Paul, but ties in so beautifully. But those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. Like Paul, Isaiah discovered this secret. Waiting on the Lord is different to just waiting. When we know we're waiting on someone that knows us, that sees us, that's moving towards us and working on our behalf, even when we can't see, we become expectant. We become hopeful. Both Isaiah and Paul found that in the middle of seasons of waiting, this gives them strength. And you see, it surprises us that strength is not found in doing more, but in depending more. Maybe we've done everything that we know how to do, and God's waiting on us to depend on him. Instead of being controlled by our disappointment and our disillusionment, instead of filling the void with unhealthy and harmful things, decisions and actions that we later regret, what if we turn to Jesus for his strength? How we respond in seasons of waiting reveals who and what we really trust. And if we're honest, we trust ourselves. We trust money. We trust power. We trust something else that we think is greater. But what if we had the opportunity to learn what both Paul and Isaiah learned? We have no idea what hangs in the balance, what it might mean if we learned this secret. It might be that we avoid our next biggest regret. Paul didn't know how his story would end. He just knew that while he was powerless, God wasn't, and that he could trust him, whatever the circumstances. Let's pray.